Hi, I'm Jacob. We're so happy you're here with us. We're just a few minutes away from beginning our service. We'd love to know where you're watching from or how we can pray for you. So please let us know in the comments and be sure to share this content with your friends. If you want prayer or prophetic encouragement, we offer free ministry available on first come, first served basis on our website. Be sure to check the description of this video for more information. Thank you so much for being here with us again, and we hope to see you again soon. Here's a word from some of our other ministries.
Hey everybody, this is Pastor David Kingsley reminding you in 2 weeks we're going to have the Pulse. Every third Friday at 6:30. The doors are open to everybody. And don't forget Isaiah 22:22. Some doors need to be open, some doors need to be closed. Let's come out to the Pulse and let's close some doors and let's open some doors. God bless you.
Hi. Most of us go through times of testing and trials, and often during these times we see negative patterns developing in our life. Often these are caused by generational curses. At the upcoming seminar, which I'll be teaching, you will get revelation and also you'll get prayer to break these curses and release the fullness of God's blessings in your life so you can walk in your calling and freedom. If you want more information, look at the description at the bottom of your screen.
Jesus promised that we would do supernatural works. Now is the time for you to step into God's power. We invite you to our Healing Intensive, in which you'll be equipped to step into a supernatural lifestyle of healings and miracles. You'll enjoy 2 jam-packed days full of practical teaching and powerful activation. Hundreds of people have been empowered through our trainings, and we can't wait to see what God will do through you too. Join us in person or online. For more information, please click the link in the description and we'll see you there.
As disciples of Jesus, it's vital that we study God's Word and start activating it in our daily lives. I'd like to invite you to Equip Nights, where our goal is to equip you for a life of impact and purpose. We're going to be diving into key subjects like your new identity, your authority in Christ, and the power of prayer, and many more. With the help of qualified teachers and an amazing course book, you're going to see some real results. These courses will be 5 sessions long, taking place once a week during the evenings, making them accessible for those who are working. For more information, please check out the description link below.
Jesus said that the sheep know the voice of the shepherd and they follow him. Yet many Christians lack confidence that they hear the voice of God for themselves. This prophetic boot camp is designed to equip you in the many ways that God speaks. You will learn to hear the voice of God yourself. You will receive prophetic ministry from many different types of people and have an opportunity to interact with the speakers and ask those questions you've always wanted to know. Join people from all over the world at the Healing Rooms of the Santa Maria Valley, November 5th and 6th, 2021. Click on the link below in the description to sign up.
To 12 on the book of 1 Corinthians. So it's going to be really good. We have Joseph Meyer starting today, and he'll also do next Thursday. And Joseph can tell you himself, because I'll butcher what he's done, but has quite an impressive education in this area. And so I'm really excited to see what he's put together as far as the history of the city of Corinth and other places during the time when Paul was writing to the Corinthians. So it'll be really good, really informative. So I encourage you over the next few weeks to bring your Bible and a laptop, or if you like the old-fashioned way like I do for taking notes, a pad of paper and a pen to take notes. And Joseph will explain this also, but we're also going to have some Q&A time. So as he's teaching, be thinking of possible questions. So we're excited to have everyone here, and grab your Bibles, 1 Corinthians. So Joseph Meyer.
Thank you.
Good morning. Oh, there's a microphone here. You can take this one, Lori. Check. Good morning. Well, my name is Joseph Meyer, and you may know me, or you've perhaps heard my voice in my capacity here as helping direct digital marketing, or perhaps you've heard my voice coming from the drum cage, but you may be unfamiliar with my voice with respect to my background in academia. And so before we jump into the study proper, I wanted to share a little bit about why I'm standing up here on the stage to begin with. When I was a teenager, I thought that I was going to make money professionally in one of two ways. First is I thought that I was going to take over my father's remodeling company. That did not happen. Secondarily, I thought that I would become a composer and an orchestral conductor. That also did not happen. And so when I was about 17 years old, there was an opportunity for me to participate in an internship at a place called the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. And the internship specifically was known for being one of the more intense, demanding, arduous opportunities to get involved in the mission space. And I thought, okay, well, I guess I'll give it a shot. And the premise of the internship was you are in the prayer room from midnight to 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. You wake up between 11 in the morning and 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and then the rest of your day is structured doing, either like evangelism, or you're in Bible studies, or you're, a janitor for the missions base, and then it's you in a prayer room in Missouri, in Kansas City. There's no distractions. It is simply you in a seat for 6 hours from midnight to 6 in the morning. And so up until that time, my view of the Bible was that it was important because my parents kind of told me it was important. Kind of like, as you're growing up in a Christian household, sometimes you can think that you're a Christian because your parents are a Christian, or you grow up with a particular political perspective because your parents have a political perspective, and you're like, well, I guess I'm that. And so my parents told me the Bible was important, so I thought the Bible was important, but I didn't really read it that frequently. And in fact, I remember being a young person, I guess technically I'm still young, but anyways, I was inspired by my friend. We must have been 12, and every single night before he went to bed, he would read one page of the Bible. And I was, that blew my mind as an 11-year-old or however old I was. I'm thinking, wow, you're like really, really intense. So my reference point for treasuring the Bible and ancient culture that enriches our understanding of the Bible, it was skin deep, it was surface level. And so when I participated in the internship, I started realizing that the Bible is filled with myriads of genres. There's at least 3 separate original languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. There's intertextuality. There are authors that are communicating back and forth. There's tension. Sometimes there's disagreement. And that really drew me in, because at first I thought it was kind of just a manual to how to be a Christian. And I guess you can't approach it that way, and you could apply it that way, but it's so much more than that. And so that really, really drew me in. So instead of taking over my father's construction company, and instead of being a composer, I decided that I was going to be a missionary. So I enrolled into Bible school, and that's where I met my wife, Sarah. And even though they offered classes in biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek, the Greek that you find in the New Testament, I didn't enroll in those classes because, in my mind, if I'm going to be a missionary somewhere in the 1040 window, then it doesn't really matter if I need to know these languages, because I'm really going to be preaching more than I'm going to be teaching. So I emphasized the preaching side of my education. So after I completed the equivalent of a degree in biblical theology. My wife and I, we marry, and I remember we were in a Barnes & Noble. This must have been a couple of months after we got married. We went on a book date, which is super darky, but anyways, she grabbed a home decor magazine. I go to the theology section, and there's this thick white book with no title on the side. And I thought, that's interesting. What's that? So I grab it, walk over to where we're sitting. I open it up, and it says, the pseudepigrapha. Now, that may be a new word to you. It was a new word for me back then. I didn't know what it meant. And the very first page says, the Apocalypse of Zephaniah. Now, I was familiar, with the equivalent of a degree in biblical theology, with the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation. Okay, that makes some sense. But Zephaniah, he's a prophet in the Old Testament, and he doesn't have an apocalypse. What is this? And so as I started reading, I saw dozens and dozens of allusions to both the Old Testament and the New Testament, but this book wasn't in the Bible? No one even told me about this. And so there in Barnes & Noble, I realized that there was a world surrounding the Bible, surrounding the New Testament, that if we had a better understanding of its context, then that can help enrich our understanding of the Bible in general. So that then clued me into thinking, you know what, if I actually want to deeply know in my life the most important set of books, then I probably should be able to read them without relying on a translation. And so at that point, I forget how old I was, 23, 24, 25, I went back to school with the principal goal, not even to get the degree, I just wanted to read the New Testament in Greek. That was kind of the end goal for me. It was really that simple. And so it was about that time that we moved to the Central Coast. And that's kind of where our stories converge here. And little did I know that the University of California in Santa Barbara has a robust ancient Greek and Latin program. So I thought, perfect. So I enrolled, and I loved every single minute of my time there. I met some of the very best individuals I may will ever meet. And at that time, I was thoroughly enjoying reading ancient literature, often in the original languages. A lot of my classes were actually translation classes. So when you're sitting there in the room, it's just Greek, it's just Latin, and the professor is there, and you're having to translate. And you know if you did a good job or bad because they're experts. And so at that point in time, I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe it makes sense for me to become a professor of ancient Greek and Latin. Maybe I can teach in a seminary. Maybe there's a teaching post available in a church, but I'm really enjoying this. I think I'm at least decent at it. So in order to be a professor, you need a PhD, so I guess I'm gonna go get a PhD. So I enroll, and I was fortunate enough to win a fully funded fellowship at the same department. And I'm thinking, okay, well, this makes sense, and this is kind of a dream come true, and it only really makes sense to explore a PhD in the humanities if you get a fully funded program. And so I say all of that, not to say that I'm right, or I'm inerrant, or I'm infallible. All that is to say is that the Bible and its world is deeply important to me personally, and I'm really excited to share with you what I've discovered along the way. Now, ultimately, this is in service to a study in 1 Corinthians. Like Lori indicated, this week and next, I'll be talking about kind of the world around 1 Corinthians proper as a letter, as an epistle. And so I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. So I have a couple targets that I'm aiming at this morning. Well, actually, let me take one step back. Part of what I'm happy to share with you guys is pictures like one being rendered behind me. This was actually taken by yours truly. In the interim between my degree at UCSB and then their PhD program, my wife and I were fortunate enough to travel to Greece And particularly, I was part of an academic program to actually learn how to speak ancient Greek, which is almost totally useless skill, but it does help you read. It does help you read a little bit. It's funny looking back now. And so this picture was taken. It was the last night of the program. We were celebrating on the top floor of a hotel in Athens, and so you're looking at the Acropolis and then the Parthenon on top, and it was a life-changing trip in many ways. I've heard similar stories of people who have gone to Jerusalem or Israel, and simply being in the desert, tasting the food, getting a sense of the culture, the sort of the civic energy, it opens up ancient literature in a way that's just impossible to access otherwise. Now, what's kind of ironic in context to this morning is I didn't actually get to visit ancient Corinth, but we drove through it several times, but we also we stayed in a hotel on the Gulf of Corinth, looking into, across the Gulf into the mountains of Delphi and the hinterlands of Macedonia, and we'll talk in a little bit why all that is significant for a study of 1 Corinthians. And so I'm really happy to share my passion with you. So with that said, also, like I mentioned earlier, but I backtracked a bit, is my vision for this morning and next week, if at all possible, I'd love there to be some interactivity, almost like a dance, if you will. We're gonna work out what the mechanics of that are like, but even though I'm happy to talk your ear off about all these topics, I'd also like to get some engagement if you guys are comfortable with that. So as I'm navigating through these topics, I'll be encouraging you to think if you have any questions, and if you're comfortable, we'll make room for those questions to be asked. There's just a couple things that I ask of you to make sense of this. Number one, try as much as possible to make sure that the questions are actually questions, and avoid jumping into a sermon, as much as I'm sure that would be fun to hear. And number two, as much as possible, ensure that they're as relevant as you're able to make it. Even though we're going to be covering a lot of material, and I'll do my very best to accommodate, if we're talking about topic Y, but then a question is like question delta, it's like, a different language and like totally over across the ocean, it'll be difficult for the whole group to kind of track together. So as I'll ask for people to be thinking about questions, feel free at any point to raise your hand, and Lori, what's up, buddy? Lori, and again, we'll kind of work out how the flow will work, but Lori will walk up to you, ask to hear your question. If it is deemed appropriate, then we'll make some time to engage at that level. And so for today and for next week, I want it to feel less like I'm the guy on stage, you're in the audience, you're listening, I'm the one talking. I want it to feel more town hallish, even though it is a teaching and I'm the one leading us through some different topics. So a little FYI about my vision for that. And then also, one disclaimer. Anyone who's familiar with the study of classics, and classics is the study of ancient Greece and Rome, certain artists and sculptors did not have an issue celebrating the human body. And with that said, I have done everything I've tried my hardest to limit exposure. I've had to disregard a lot of evidence, which is actually painful because that's part of the ancient world. And there's, I think, a healthy level of confronting that, but I didn't think it was appropriate for today. So with that said, there may be slides that you may feel that could be questionable, and you are legitimate to feel that way. I've done what I can to limit that. Of course, I don't think they're questionable, but again, I studied classics, and I've seen a lot of things. So just a little FYI about that. And of course, I'm totally open to your feedback. If in the future you want me to be even more conservative, than I've been, I'm happy to try and do that, but at the same time, there's only a certain limit of evidence that meets that criteria. Great, so let's move on. So, one challenge I have in context to trying to fill out the world of ancient Corinth in the day of Paul is we only have so much time to do that. And thus, if you've ever been traveling through like the Gobi Desert and you're like, I want to watch a YouTube video or I want to put on Netflix, and you have like 2G wireless signal and it's like, hey, I'm buffering, and then whenever the video starts to load, it's all blurry and like the audio is kind of like crackling and you can only sort of get a sense of what's being said, and that's the resolution, so to speak, at which we can explore some of these topics, simply by virtue of the amount of time that we have. So that's one a confining component that I'm asking you to be patient and extend your understanding. At the same time, it's also an opportunity that if there's sufficient interest, we can go deeper on these topics. Or it's an opportunity for you, if you find one of these kind of categories that we're skimming through, it's an opportunity for you to buy a couple books and go deeper. And I'm, of course, super, super happy to go on that journey with you. Another way to think about this, like if you've ever flown over Yosemite, well, actually, let me take one step back. The resolution here, the limitations aren't knit to the accuracy of what we're talking about. Obviously, I'm not going to say something that I don't think I can actually defend it academically, but we're talking about the completeness and the amount of nuance available to properly justify and contextualize the different topics that we're going through. And so I liken it to flying over Yosemite, in that if you're in an airplane and you're flying over, like that is Yosemite, but you only have like 7 seconds to enjoy it. And so the different resolutions would be, if there are some topics that we may be able to drive through Yosemite, in that there's maybe a couple minutes worth of getting a different perspective of, there's Half Dome or there are the different waterfalls, versus a deep dive in which we camp at Yosemite for 7 full days. We explore everything. We go up the different waterfalls, and we have a more personal, experiential understanding of Yosemite. So for us, in this context, we're doing the flyover version, not the camping there for 7 days, even though that would be awesome, but we just don't have the time for that. So little FYI about that. Now, wait a minute. I'm going... Yes, okay, great. One goal I have is when we read 1 Corinthians, it's really easy, and I'm guilty of this too, of being in the passenger seat and automatically being on Paul's team, so to speak. And that as you're reading, you're thinking, yeah, Corinthians, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, you guys are arrogant, and you're lewd, and you're immoral, and you're totally chaotic. Of course, Paul, you're completely right. You guys have no idea what you're talking about. At the same time, and this is some of the topics we're going to be diving into, imagine this. You see your phone's calling, or you get an email from a familiar friend, and you're thinking, oh great, I haven't talked to this guy in a little bit. I wonder what he's up to. I wonder what he wants to talk about. So you answer the phone, and suddenly it's a diatribe of everything you've done wrong, and you're completely taken off guard because you think, well, actually, with respect to what you said, I actually thought I had integrity. I actually was doing the best that I knew how, and I actually didn't even think I was doing anything wrong. Now, I'm not saying that Paul is wrong and that the Corinthians are right. That's not what I'm saying. However, I am saying that there's two sides, and imagine being a Greek Corinthian. You've lived in that system, that culture, the legacy of the city and literature, and we're going to be diving into it in a little bit. You meet Paul, you decide to become a Christian, but your reference point is not Judaism. Your reference point is not Paul's way of viewing the world. Your reference point is you are a follower of Dionysus. And so you're thinking, oh, if Paul wants me to prophesy, it actually means like this. But Paul, then he hears, but he's like, no, don't do that. And you're like, what do you mean? This is my only reference point. So again, it's not claiming Paul's wrong and Corinthians are right. It's looking at the human element. It's trying to expand our understanding of the world in which the 1 Corinthians was delivered. And it's trying to read 1 Corinthians as if we were a Corinthian. And that's actually one main point I want to drive home here, is as we're going through the letter, and in particular today and next week, I want us to do our best to pretend we're a Corinthian and read the letter from their perspective. Now, of course, there's limitations to that, and at some level we're pretending, but I hope to sort of align our perspective in that direction for our purposes here. Additionally, there's some challenges with doing just that. You can see the subtitle here is is that the word I wanted to use? I guess it is. Okay, sorry, my brain just push pause for a second. Restructuring the past to understand the epistle. Reconstructing. Okay, there it is. Sorry, I was missing that second prefix there. Reconstructing what we're ultimately, so with respect to history of the ancient Mediterranean world, there's a term that scholars use that called reconstruction. Now, if you're familiar with like the Meta podcast space, and there's a different way that word is used in terms of kind of rediscovering your spiritual life. I don't mean it in that sense. I mean it in a more technical, academic sense, in which reconstruction implies that you have to rebuild something. And the idea there is the past happened. Now, I guess we could argue metaphysically about that statement, but that's not neither here or there. And that's, anyways, but so for our purposes, the past happened. However, we don't have a tape recorder. We don't have a YouTube video of what precisely happened. So in order to make sense of the past, we have to take the evidence that has survived the accident of history and rebuild what we think actually happened. And an analogy of this is, imagine there was the equivalent of a Jenga game, you know, like the wooden rectangles, and you build a little tower, and you see, you know, who can last the longest in terms of pulling them out. So imagine there's a Jenga game that some children were playing 2,000 years ago in Pompeii. Something grabs their attention. They go off and start playing another game, but this Jenga was, you know, half. This particular game was sort of half completed. Well, over time, they forgot about it, and storms came and blew it over, and then Vesuvius erupted and got covered in ash, and wars were fought. And now the job of the historian of ancient history is they have to reconstruct that Jenga game as it actually was played. But that feels impossible, right? Well, that's the challenge. And so the historian of ancient history may find 2, 3, 4 of those Jenga pieces on the ground, but well, which one went where? And even if they are able to create some hypothetical model of how this worked, is there a religious significance to the Jenga game? Is there a political significance? Is it just kids having fun? Like, you have to also interpret it. Like, why is it significant? What does it mean? And so that's another challenge we have in terms of understanding 1 Corinthians, is we have to engage in this process called reconstruction. The third kind of overarching goal here is I also want to inspire empathy. And what I mean by that is this image is an artistic representation of Corinth being besieged by Romans in 146 BC. Part of it wasn't really technically part of the Third Punic War, but it was during the same ending year in which Carthage was also destroyed. And for those of us who's has some familiarity with the story of Jerusalem, Jerusalem has also, through its history, been besieged and laid to waste. And men of military age slaughtered, women and children sold off to other countries. And so there's also this common human element between Jerusalem and Corinth that I want to try and bridge that gap. In addition to, kind of as a sort of slight tangent in this point, that when we look at the New Testament, it's clear that the Jerusalem Christians also didn't have all their ducks in a row either. And so even though we may legitimately point our fingers at the Corinthians for doing X, Y, and Z incorrectly, well, the Jerusalem church also had its fair share of issues. And so, again, there's this kind of common ground, common human element that I also want to bring to the surface to better understand Paul, but also to better understand the Corinthians. These are the topics. No? I spoke through this. This is a artistic representation of Jerusalem being besieged by the Romans in 70 AD. So again, there's a convergence of both of those cities in ancient history with respect to total devastation, in this case, in both cases by the Romans. These are the topics that I hope to cover today and tomorrow. The top two represent what I hope to get through today. I did some beta tests and I wasn't totally successful, so we'll see on how far I actually can meander through that. Next week, we'll hopefully get to the bottom two. I'll give some advertisements, or maybe not really an advertisement. I'll give some signposts so that right now you're able to get a sense of where we're going to better make sense, kind of the whole trajectory. So one of the first topics is we'll look at ancient Greek prophecy, and you'll see that underneath the different headers, I'm specifically looking at ancient topics that make better sense of 1 Corinthians in particular. And so when we think about prophecy, we, in particular in 1 Corinthians 14, it's easy to superimpose what we think Paul meant. Now, we may be able to exegetically try and extract Paul's point of view on what he actually meant by prophecy or prophetic ministry, but the framework of an ancient Greek or Roman, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, had some really important differences. And so imagine being a Corinthian and you hear from Paul, hey, you need to prophesy. And we'll look at what that means, and that can also help speak to some of the issues that Paul encountered when writing to the Corinthian church. The second topic is Interpretatio Graeca, and that's actual Latin used from an ancient source, and it represents a problem that Paul likely repeatedly encountered, not just at Corinth, but also in Athens and in Philippi, and we'll talk about those hopefully if we have time. And it represents a fundamental conflict of worldview, specifically religious worldview, between Paul in a monotheistic, more or less, Christianity, or earliest Christianity, and a polytheistic worldview shared by ancient Greco-Roman cultures. And so that helps to specify Paul's repeated emphases in these passages here in 1 Corinthians 8 and in 1 Corinthians 10. I think I wrote them there. Okay. That's more or less accurate. The Bacchae helps us potentially understand Paul's comments about women towards the end of his encouragement to prophesy. He talks about a church needing to have order and women needing to be quiet. Now, that's a complicated set of verses with a very specific context. Yet there's also, like I said, there's a world around which those words were written, and there are repeated incidences in the ancient world of, in particular, women manifesting, prophetic agency in a very wild and crazy manner. And so if you're a woman in Corinth, Greece, you hear Paul for the first time, you're thinking, I want to join this. But you've been initiated into the cult of Dionysus, and so your assumption is when you participate in one of these rituals, you need to lose your mind, because that's what you do. And there's more nuance to that. I'm painting with the broad brush. Of course, I'm speaking at that low, fuzzy resolution here. There's exceptions to all of this. But you could imagine Paul hearing stories of X, Y, and Z happening, and he's saying, no, this isn't actually the way we're going to do this. But their reference point is fundamentally different than his. And again, I'm not pointing a finger here. I'm simply trying to bring out the meaning and the difficulty that both Paul and the Corinthians experienced. And then the last of which, again, hopefully next week, we will be looking at a healing sanctuary of Asclepius. And what's fascinating here is this was just outside of Corinth. And as far as I am aware, it was still active in Paul's day. And so when Paul is describing his desire for Corinthian Christians to engage in healings and in specifically healing miracles, there was not that it was Paul's context, but for Corinthian Christians, there already existed a context for what that looked like and what that meant. And so, it gives sort of added layers and meaning to what it meant to be a Christian in Corinth in Paul's day. Now, let's now dive in. Actually, at this point, does anyone have a question? Or this is kind of an opportunity that as we dive into the more specific components, I want you to, if you're comfortable thinking about a question that you may ask. If you do have a question, just sneak your hand up and we'll accommodate your question. Let's jump on in. Any discussion of ancient Greek religion, of prophecy, any subcategories of that topic arguably has to start with Homer. And I don't mean The Simpsons, even though it's actually a really funny parallel there. For example, who here has heard of SpongeBob SquarePants? Okay, most people, if we're being honest. Okay, who here has heard the song Baby Shark? Okay, most people. The ubiquity or the universality of a deep, comprehensive, thorough knowledge of Homer, even in Corinth of Paul's day, was even deeper than the pervasiveness of Baby Shark and SpongeBob SquarePants in today's culture. If you were a Greek, you knew Homer inside and out. Homer was, there's exceptions to this, he was the Greek Moses. And Homer's poetry was to the Greeks what the law was to the Jewish people. It is almost impossible to overstate how significant, how principal, and how fundamental it is to understanding Greek religion as a category without also having a baseline understanding of Homeric poetry. One reason why this is significant for us is there, and we touched on it just a few moments ago, there was a fundamental difference between the way that, in particular, conservative Jews conceptualize God versus the way the typical average, like bell chart, kind of the mid-range, the average Greek or Roman conceptualize their pantheon. So when we look at the Hebrew Bible, we see overwhelmingly that God is thought of as a loving father, that even in the New Testament, Jesus says, be perfect because your heavenly Father is perfect. God's just. God is the embodiment of purity. You kind of take every possible good virtue, throw it in a blender, and that is God. Well, the Greeks in particular flip that idea on its head. So instead of saying that you need to be perfect because your heavenly Father is perfect, they instead said, and again, exceptions to all this, they said that actually the reason why we're all screwed up and there's immorality and we're betraying each other and humanity in general is a mess, that's because the gods are crazy. Like, the gods are immoral, the gods lie, the gods bicker. That's actually why we're all screwed up. So you can even see that Paul, coming from his background, is also having to engage in a culture that views it inside out, upside down. And there's a couple remarks in Paul that it seems like he's addressing this kind of territory. But I wanted to share in a story form the setup for the Iliad, which was one of the main epic poems of Homer. And through this story, setting up the stage for the Iliad, I want this to help color our sort of pretend scenario of reading reading 1 Corinthians as a Corinthian, and contrast it with what I imagine is our common understanding of or just take, how do I want to say this? And compare it with Paul's descriptions of God. So the setup for the Iliad is an epic poem. It uses an ancient time signature, and it covers the last few weeks of the Trojan War. The Trojan War by itself was a 10-year-long siege, but the Iliad in particular only focuses on the last tiny little bit. Now, you may ask, well, why was there even a Trojan War to begin with? And thus, here's the setup. There was a divine wedding between a nymph, Thetis, and a human, Peleus. And they were prophesied to have a son, Achilles. Now, if you're familiar with Iliad at any level, these names should be roughly familiar. And the prophecy concerning Achilles was that he would eventually grow up and overthrow Zeus. Zeus is typically the most powerful, or he's conceived as being the most powerful Greek god within their pantheon. Zeus does not like this prophecy, so he wants to ensure that he can do whatever he needs to do to stop this from happening. But if he plays his hand incorrectly, it could actually flip around and bite him in a way that would make it worse. So there's a divine wedding, and for the parents of Achilles, and all the gods are invited, except for the goddess of discord. Her name is Eris. And you could think from Zeus's point of view, it makes sense not to invite the goddess of discord at a wedding because she's just going to screw everything up, so just keep her out of it. Well, she shows up anyway, and she stopped at the door. And the god that said you can't come in, hey, you can't come in, Zeus doesn't want you here. She's like, okay, that's totally fine. So she takes out an apple made of gold, and there's some parallels here with the Genesis story. Apple made of gold, and inscribed on it, there's no name, it simply says, "To the most beautiful." And she rolls it across the floor, and Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite, they're standing having a conversation, and it lands right in the middle. Well, they all look down, and they think it's for them. But it's not entitled to anyone in particular. And so they're excited individually because they think, oh, I get this golden apple, and it's to the most beautiful of all the Greek gods, or goddesses. However, they needed to figure out to whom it actually belonged. So they approach Zeus. Again, it's in the commotion of a wedding. And they ask, hey, who's this belong to? Well, Zeus is like, I don't want anything to do with this. And he doesn't answer. And part of that is Hera is Zeus's wife. Athena is Zeus's daughter. And depending on the source, either Aphrodite is his daughter or she belongs to the generation of gods that came before Zeus. So for him, it's a lose, lose, lose. If you pick any one of these women, then the other two are going to stab you in the back. So I'm out of this. I'm not talking to this. I'm not speaking to the situation. So they accept that, and so they go to the other gods. at the wedding, and all of them are like, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm not giving you an answer. So as the women are navigating around the wedding, Zeus thinks, actually, you know what? I could use this for my advantage because I don't want Achilles to take over my throne. I also think there's too many humans living on the earth, and I need to lower their population. Again, there's a commonality there with Genesis. And there are too many demigods, and what I mean there is demigod would be you have one divine parent and a mortal parent, and again, another commonality with Genesis. There's too many people, too many demigods, and I don't want Achilles getting in my way, so I am going to try to make this work in my favor. So they circle around back to Zeus, and Zeus says, hey, there's a shepherd in Troy whose name is Paris. I think he's going to be able to help you guys figure out whose this apple belongs to. So they said, great. So Paris, he's 15 years old. He's just hanging out in Troy, being a shepherd kid. He's a prince. And so suddenly 3 Greek goddesses show up with this golden apple, and they ask, which one owns the apple? And he replies, well, what are you going to give me? So Hera says, I will make you king over all of Asia. And Paris is like, nah, I don't want that. So Athena said, hey, I will make you the wisest person in the world. There's kind of a parallel with Solomon there. And he's like, nah, I don't care. So Aphrodite says, hey, you know what? I'll simplify this for you. I just want the apple, and I'll just make the most beautiful woman in the world fall in love with you. He's like, okay, deal. Give me I'll take your apple, I want the woman. So a couple years go by. Paris, being a prince of Troy, is on a diplomatic mission to Sparta in Greece. Helen, who was the queen of Sparta, she, through Aphrodite, falls in love with him. Depending on the source, and again, I'm painting with a broad stroke here, kind of low resolution, he elopes with her back to Troy. Menelaus, the king of Sparta, he realizes what's happened. So then he calls, and he evokes an ancient pledge to both restore his honor and to return his wife. And that's the initial opening to the Iliad and to the Trojan War. And so, again, taking a step back, the description of the gods, the goddesses, the intrigue, the pettiness, Zeus wanting to, obviously engaging in intrigue, that's a very different divine model than our understanding of the God of the Bible, especially as it becomes more fleshed out in the New Testament. And so imagine Paul interacting with Corinthians who have a similar model to that. And so you can see from his point of view, there's a pastoral component of how do you start, I kind of think of like when you're restoring like an old painting or something, you have to chip away at all the layers. You can imagine the monumental task that Paul had to deal with someone whose reference point for God is Aphrodite just wanting the apple. Like it's a very different foreign model. Now, what's also interesting is the Iliad and the Odyssey are some of the earliest documents in the Western canon. There was a dark age in Greece. It happened way before the dark ages in Europe. And once people started writing again, some of the very first documents to pop up are the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it's so old that it sort of blends into writing versus memory. And so whatever was written in the Iliad and the Odyssey also represent times and memories that happened even before they were actually written. And here you can see this is Iliad, second book. Corinth shows up. And at this point in history, again, Iliad is also reaching back into the memory of the past. And already at the dawn of Western literature, Corinth is already known for being wealthy. And an interesting component and an interesting source of significance for this, and again, it's hard to tell if Paul himself was interacting with the Iliad specifically. I don't think he was. But there's a legacy in Corinth of being powerful, of being wealthy, and Paul, twice, especially early on in 1 Corinthians, he plays with the idea of wealth. The first time, Paul indicates that they are already wealthy, and it's likely that he's referring to the spiritual inheritance of their decision to become Christians. Yet later in the letter, I think it's 1 Corinthians 4, he flips the idea on its head in that there's a wealth of knowledge, not just currency, but because there's also a wealth of knowledge within the legacy and the heritage of the story of Corinth, that you run into the problem of being boastful, of being prideful, of being arrogant, of being a know-it-all. And he, in essence, says, well, look, if you want to die on the hill of being a know-it-all and you think you're right, well, you have your reward. If that's really what's valuable to you, then that's your wealth. So we see that we see that Paul is interacting with this legacy, with the story of Corinth being wealthy. The next slide is in a similar pillar to the story of Corinth being wealthy, but again, in the Iliad, the dawn of Western civilization, by this point in time, the city of Corinth is also, give me a few minutes, is also associated with prophecy. And so here, we have a man whose name is Euchenor, whose father, Polydius, that is kind of a Greek play on words for meaning like know-it-all or knows a lot of different things. His father is a prophet. And the story goes that Polydius is speaking to his son. They both live in Corinth. And his father prophesies to his son saying, look, son, you're going to die in one of two ways. You get to pick. Either you are going to waste away in the halls of this city in your own home, or you are going to die on the battlefields of Troy. Now, this brings up the question of the interpretation of prophecy. How much of prophecy is a participation? You can see that if you euphemistically interpret the prophecy, the father could be saying something like, you're either going to die wasting your life away frivolously, or you can die doing what you believe in. But nonetheless, the son, hearing the words, decides, well, I'm going to go to Troy. So in this particular passage, the Trojans are advancing against the Greeks, and Euchenor, he's fighting Hector. He's the Trojan version of Achilles, kind of like a Trojan Samson in a way. And Hector kills Euchenor. And so even like the descriptions of Corinth being associated with vast wealth, one of the earliest mentions of Corinth as a city in Western literature is also its connection to prophecy. And within this framework, and we'll talk about this more in depth later, Paul frequently describes the wealth of knowledge and wisdom that is also part of the story of being a Corinthian. So Paul is interacting, again, not necessarily with the Iliad here, but that there's a trajectory from the people's earliest memories of Corinth to Paul's day, and Paul's engaging within that system. And like I said earlier, if you were a Greek and you were a Corinthian, you would have, maybe, how do I say this? You would have been familiar at some level with the representation of Corinth, your own city, within the poems of Homer. And so there's a sort of sense of pride, sense of belonging in a sense, and Paul is interacting with that framework and with that story. Rory, do you want to, do you still have a question? So Lori's going to field that question. As that is happening, this is a segue, and we'll take probably a break. If the question is appropriate, we'll take a break right after that. This is our segue. So Euchenor and his father, Corinth and prophecy. This is our segue into an introduction. Again, low resolution, painting with broad strokes. We're flying over Yosemite, our introduction into Greek prophecy. And my intent here, and we talked about this before, is imagine we were in the small house group of Christians in Corinth. We received the letter from Paul that indicates that you need to be eager to prophesy. Well, what did that really mean? And it would be a mistake to superimpose by default Jewish models. Now that would be correct to understanding Paul's sense of prophecy, but not the Corinthian sense of prophecy. And so again, it's building that bridge between the two. We good? So we'll take a pause here. Chuck. Oh, sure, yeah.
Here is Chuck.
Okay, I really appreciate this whole layout, so I'm just making that. You're really doing a great job. So you brought up a point that I may not have understood and want clarification on.
Could I get the microphone also coming through this monitor? Is that possible? Keep going.
Okay, so you're bringing up the point, which I never realized, of resurrecting historical documents. Would that be an accurate statement?
Contextualize your question.
So you made reference to the Dark Ages
Yes.
in Europe, where the common person didn't have access to literature or writing. So was this the same thing that was going on in the time frame where writing was being resurrected from the past?
That's a great question. With respect to the Dark Age in Greece, which was a separate time period than the Dark Age in Europe, and scholars may even bicker about that description of the Dark Age in the Middle Ages. The point that I want to draw out, so I may be answering your question kind of flanking in a way, is the context of Homeric poetry is an oral culture. And there are really fascinating parallels with that also being the case in earliest Christianity with respect to the Gospels contain written forms of early Christian oral performances of telling the Jesus story. And so most individuals probably didn't know how to read, but obviously they could understand Greek. And so it's a really complicated topic to discuss the Iliad as oral performances and then its representation in literature. And there's probably hundreds of hours to answer that in depth. But by the time Homeric poetry came into fruition, these poems would have already been widely known across the ancient Greek world. Let's see. I'm trying to think of how deep into the topic I want to go. Am I going in the right direction to answering your question, or do you want me to focus a bit more on some? Yeah, so during the Dark Age in Greece, again, painting with a broad brush, right? We don't have, to my knowledge, any written or any evidence that has writing on it. Prior to the Dark Age, there was a script called Linear B, and even before that, there's Linear A, but that's like that's like late Bronze Age, and I don't have a lot of experience in that time. But during the Dark Age of Greece, there was tumult and frequent wars and destruction of major city sites. And so because the language, like the way you write Greek changed from Linear B to then Homeric poetry, there had to be a time of the culture figuring out, like, we're changing alphabets, like we're changing the way we're representing speech. And so in that interim, people are still communicating, people are still talking, bards are still singing songs. And so through that period, the Homeric performances start gaining traction, and then during the time of the resurgence, and the Greeks began to write again, at that point in time, they were able to then not codify, but they were able to then represent the Homeric oral performances in writing. So it's kind of, how do I say this? It was sort of the natural progression of you have a writing script, war and other variables take that away. The culture has to rediscover what it means to have a writing ability, but the story of the culture is still progressing. And so at the time at which writing then comes back, they are in a position to then translate, I'm using that word loosely, the spoken phonetic, kinetic sounds into a new script. Does that kind of get to what you're talking? Okay, thank you, Chuck. Awesome, so before we jump into an introduction to Greek prophecy, I've already been talking for like 50 minutes. Oh, we have a question? Okay, we'll keep going here. Yeah, you can go here and fill that. I'll sorry? Yeah, I guess so, sure.
I don't know what to say now. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, I love this, understanding the culture, how we're reviewing the things. Brings me to 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul deals with this issue of the man who is involved with his father's wife. And he's confronting the church about their not confronting the issue. Is that a typical, because we are formed by Greek culture, and it was part of their culture, they were reluctant to confront issues?
That's a great question. It depends at sort of which resolution I answer your question at. At the highest level, the general response would be not really, in that Greeks are known for debating. And so not necessarily, so ancient Greek, like you have ancient philosophy, you have political discourse and disagreement. And so generally as a culture, they do have an investment in figuring out how to think and figuring out how to set the trajectory of society in the best direction. So generally speaking, with respect to the situation in Corinth, I'm going to speculate a little bit, but to my knowledge, most estimates of the total population of Christians when just after Paul's missionary efforts estimate that they were actually pretty low. And so the total sample size we have for the small house groups, small house churches, basically, like ecclesia, just means like a gathering. Like this is a gathering. Like that's all it means, just a group of people gathering together. Likely were small. They met in houses. Houses weren't very big, so the total amount of people had to be in context to how many people can actually fit into a house. And so, because we have a small sample size that potentially skews. How do I say this? Like if we extrapolate from that small sample size, it could paint a picture that is accurate at the smallest level in terms of problems that specifically that house church was having in Corinth versus is this a common issue throughout Greek history? Now, Greeks had, even like when we look at the Hebrew Bible, like I'm thinking like Hosea's wife, like the Jews also were not immune to immorality, even sort of shocking amounts of it. And so I think that I guess my response to that would be it seems to be a local issue that is shocking. However, to my knowledge, that wasn't something that was done widespread. Now, talking about ancient ethics with respect to marriage and intimacy, that's a whole can of worms, super, super interesting. That would be an interesting topic to dive into because that actually would give some language to your question. For our purposes here, I think I'm happy with kind of talking about, it looks like that was a local level problem and being careful about how we use that to think broadly about the topic. Is that okay? Cool. Any other questions before we go on a break?
I just had one question to
Yeah.
ask about clarifying when Paul's making the statement in, I think it's 1 Corinthians 1:22. He kind of gives a generalized statement that the Jews request a sign and Greeks seek after wisdom. Was that a real clear, genuine, across the board response? I mean, just thinking even about our culture today, in how we're ministering to people, interacting with people, to understand that cultural difference could have a great impact on how we approach people.
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, there's a slide that talks about that very section. I guess I'll give a quick signpost towards it. Those two categories of divine power and wisdom were not necessarily incompatible to ancient Greeks. Now, I'm not claiming that Paul was confused. Obviously, Paul, there's a concern throughout that first kind of 4 or 5 chapters that certain Corinthians seem to be arrogant or intellectually stubborn. At the same time, and if we have time today, we'll go through it, 2, again, broad strokes, kind of reconstructing that 2,000-year-old Jenga game. Broad strokes is in ancient Greek thought. Those two were not only compatible, but they often went hand in hand. And so the way, in terms of if I were a Corinthian and I'm listening to someone read Paul's letter to me, again, we're pretending here, but to me, that I either could interpret that as Paul's misunderstanding my culture, which as a human, that very well could have happened. The other side is Paul may be attempting, or I guess the interpretation of that would be, I need to find a way to balance these. Because if you go into one extreme or the other, and there's kind of examples on both sides that I hope to get to, if it's not this week, the next week, that you can get into excess. And Paul then later in what 1 Corinthians 14 talks about order and fighting chaos in church. And so I guess that would be my approach initially to your question, but we actually have a slide at some point that actually gets into more nitty-gritty details, but I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Any other questions? Great, let's take a 5-minute break. I'm gonna grab some water and then see you at 11:08. Thanks. 2-minute warning. Thirty seconds. Okie dokie. I'm going to begin. In theory, I'm not bugged if you keep talking, though I may be interrupting your conversation at this point. As I predicted, I haven't even started my first topic, and it's an hour and 10 minutes in. Like I said, I did some beta testing, and I thought I'd be ahead of the curve, but I'm not. So for today, my aim will be to fly over the Yosemite of ancient Greek prophecy at a low resolution. And the goal of that is to help fill out the sense of an ancient Corinthian. Let's say they are day one new believer. What's their framework for prophecy? One difference, well, there's a lot of differences. Maybe a concern. Concern's probably too strong of a word. I guess I'll just kind of go with the idea. We would miss out on valuable meaning if we superimpose Jewish prophecy onto Corinthian Greeks or Romans. There are some similarities, and we'll get to them, yet there are fascinating and key differences that help us make sense of if you were a Corinthian and you heard the Greek word for you need to prophesy, what that meant to you. You can see here the image. There is an eagle flying over. I guess I should take one step back and say that I guess I should take 2 step backs and say that everything that I have said and will say is overly generalized. There's a counterpoint to everything I have to say. Due to the constraints of time, I have to paint with a broad brush, so just FYI. Now, taking one step ahead is prophecy in ancient Greek and even Roman religion is categorical. What I mean by that is when we read ancient Hebrew prophecy, or maybe in our own context, when we hear the word prophecy or you need to prophesy, we could easily limit that to simply mean you are speaking in a common language and you are telling someone something. Well, that's only one pillar out of many pillars in what prophecy means or was expressed or manifested in the ancient Greco-Roman world. And so that's what I mean by prophecy as a category. There were many different ways, many different even jobs or training or schools that existed that had a specialization in these different pillars. Now, this is non-exhaustive, and arguably each of these pillars have sub-pillars. So this is, again, broad strokes. The first pillar is augury. You can see the image behind is a picture of an eagle. Augury had to deal with the interpretation of the flight path of birds. And you can even expand that. There were prophets who interpreted the falling trajectory of leaves. Now, that may sound silly and asinine. However, even in Homer, in the Iliad, there exists augury of people interpreting if these birds or this particular bird flies this direction or that direction, here is a prophecy. In other words, it's kind of like almost the gods were writing in the sky, so to speak, using the pencil of a bird. And if you could interpret that actual flight path, then that could give you access to how to make the right decision. Now, a skeptic could look at that and say, well, that's ridiculous. Like, what do you mean? The bird's flying around? Like, the bird's going to be crazy. Just a bird is a bird. However, there was, at some level, within the Greek experience, and even Romans, enough success for it to continue as a main pillar of prophecy, to the point that military generals bringing their armies to battle had a group of prophets, each in their own specialty, one of which being an augur, and they consulted the prophets, like actual military generals, asking, should we attack the flank? Should we wait until tomorrow? Should we fight the battle on the hill or in the plains? And so it could be potentially easy to reduce the significance of what augury was. And Greeks themselves also challenged this idea, and if we have time, we'll get to it. But nonetheless, it is a major pillar. But what I also like to think about is, we're reconstructing what it means to put ourselves in the feet, so to speak, of an ancient Corinthian. So you could imagine, this is a hypothetical kind of example, that Paul, he's maybe discipling a Corinthian, Greek, and maybe it's their first day. And the Corinthian, maybe they're walking down the agora, and the Corinthian sees a bird moving down to the right, and he's like, "Hey, Paul, I have a word for you." And Paul's like, "Okay, like we have to have a conversation about this." And so, to my knowledge, the Jews did not engage in augury, yet there's this component of Greek prophecy that Paul, at some level, may have had to deal with. The second, and this is probably a more familiar category, is dreams. And again, this is also a really important and fundamental component of Jewish prophecy. I'm not going to go into too much detail because that maps on fairly well. A fun little freebie, however, is in Greek, you don't say that Joseph had a dream. Instead, the way the Greek renders is a dream stood next to Joseph. Now, that's an interesting way to conceptualize how that happens. Now, in a Greek class, I would have points deducted off if I wrote in English, a dream stood next to Joseph, because that's not how we explain that idea. But in terms of when you are reading the Greek, that's the way it's rendered. And so that's a kind of a fun word picture to kind of think about how within the language, that's how they, there's this sort of dance, this interaction between the agency of the dream and the person sleeping. So I think that's a kind of a cool idea. And that's also the case in when Joseph, Jesus' father has a dream. The dream stood next to Joseph. So I think that's a kind of a cool little detail. Portent is a familiar category, also used somewhat loosely in ancient Jewish religion. This involves an eclipse or a star or an earthquake, something like that. Again, it maps on fairly well, so we're not going to go into that for today. The next component is somewhat graphic, so I'll keep that to a minimum. It is the study and the translation of entrails of an animal. And people were particularly trained during a sacrifice to slice open the gut of a sheep, an unblemished sheep or a ram, and as they're looking at the way the insides are laid out, they prophesy from that spot, similar to augury. Now, you could imagine, again, in our hypothetical example of a Corinthian trying to learn to prophesy, they ask Paul to visit them to a temple, and they buy a ram and slice it open, and Paul's like, "What are you doing? Like this." And so, but that's a reference point for valid prophecy in ancient Greece. Moreover than that, beyond just interpreting the insides of an animal, you could also take the liver and cook it. And I don't know what the chemistry term is, but after the proteins have solidified and the thing shrinks down a little bit, you could interpret that like a map and also be inspired to prophecy after you cook the liver. Now, to us, that's maybe a weird thing. Yet that was a valid means of prophecy in ancient Greece. So remember, you're a Corinthian, you're reading Paul's command, you need to prophesy. You need to make sure you're speaking the same language in terms of how that is manifested, right? And so that's an interesting component there. The last, not in an absolute sense, but in terms of kind of what we'll be talking about, this is technically a combined category. They actually could be separate pillars, but in certain cases, they are one and the same. Ecstatic in Greek literally means standing outside. And in English, we have an idiom, it's a bit more derogatory, but it's you're out of your mind. It means you're crazy. And the force of ecstatic prophecy is also described in ancient literature as someone becomes mad or manic. Mania takes over them. They become overly frenzied, and from that place of ecstasy, they begin to prophesy. Moreover, enthusiasm, that's literally Greek for God-possessed. Now, in English, it means something different, but there's etymology that are connected. In certain translations, it could be rendered like demon-possessed or spirit-possessed, but literally in Greek, it means God inside of you. And so, in some instances in ancient literature, and we'll look at a few in a second, these can happen together. And obviously, if from the Greek point of view, if you are literally possessed by Apollo, the god of prophecy, then you're simply a medium by which he's taking control of your body in a sense. And so what's interesting about these two last phrases, ecstatic and enthusiasm, not always, but there are a non-insignificant amount of instances in which women are those who experience ecstatic prophecy or enthusiasm, or ecstatic enthusiasm independent from men. What's fascinating to me about that observation, and we'll look at a couple examples, is within the context of Paul asking people to prophesy in 1 Corinthians, he sort of the PS is, by the way, don't get crazy, be at peace, have order, and I don't permit women to speak. Now, that's a complicated statement. We'll get to unpacking that a bit later. And I'm not claiming that Corinthians, how do I say this? I'm not claiming that Corinthians, that women in Corinth specifically did this. And I'm not claiming that Paul is specifically referring to this model. However, there are fascinating commonalities between valid expressions of women in ancient Greek and Roman times of being ecstatic and enthusiastic while operating in their context as prophetesses, and the relationship between Paul saying, I want you to prophesy, by the way, you need to be orderly, and we have to figure out the women contributing to this thing. So interesting potential overlap there. So due to the time, we're going to skip a couple of slides. Next week, if it makes sense, we can maybe return. But for now, I want to jump into the, how do I say this? So if an ancient Corinthian who was a Greek knew of any literature, it would be Homer, like we talked about. If you ask that same hypothetical Greek, who's the most well-known prophetic influence you know of, 99% of the time they would say the priestess at Delphi. the significance of the Pythian priestess at Delphi also finds expression in the New Testament. Acts, I think it's 16. Paul is at Philippi, and if you remember, there's a woman who's literally a slave prophet. She gives prophecies to people, and she makes her slave masters money. The word that most translations use, or the word that most translations translate as, she has a spirit of divination, or she had the ability to foresee the future. Different translations translate it differently. It's literally just she had a Pythian spirit, which really means she was possessed by Apollo. And so if we view 1 Corinthians, and if we map that onto the chronology of Paul's missionary journey with respect to Acts, Paul himself would have had some experience with this very model of prophecy, having encountered a girl who was enthusiasm, who was enthusiastic by the spirit of Apollo, the god of prophecy. And so it ties in beyond just the injunction to actually prophesy, but also, again, if we think about Acts and Paul's journey as described by Luke, this is, I don't know if I want to say the heart and center, but this is one of the closer examples to, we can take what we explore in this topic, and it's a bit closer to home with respect to reading 1 Corinthians. So you may have a question, and I do, and scholars still do, of what's the connection between Pythian, which we get the word python, snake. What's the connection between a snake or a python and Apollo? Why isn't she just the priestess of Apollo? Why does she have to be called the Pythian priestess? The short answer, and this is going to feel insufficient, but nonetheless it is, let me take a step back. Apollo, in the Homeric hymns, these are very, very old mythological poems. The mythology is that Apollo slayed a primordial serpent, and that's a pretty common feature amongst ancient Mediterranean mythologies or religions. For example, even Yahweh in the Old Testament, I think it's in the Psalms, he slays the Leviathan. So no matter kind of which system you're looking at, you're expecting at some point for a god to kill a snake. That's just kind of the expected thing you do. So Apollo kills a snake. Then he decides that he's going to turn himself into a dolphin. He jumps into the Aegean Sea, and he reprimands a boat full of sailors. And he says, I'm basically going to kidnap you. You're going to have to say goodbye to your family and your children, and you are all going to be my priests at Delphi. So he leads them as a dolphin to Delphi to set up his sanctuary. And that's the relationship, a very simplified, low-resolution view and explanation for why she's called the Pythian priestess while channeling Apollo. Now, even scholars are still puzzled by that relationship, and there's vehement debate as to why that is. So if it feels like, I don't really follow that, I don't either, and scholars are still trying to piece that together, but nonetheless, she's known as the Pythian priestess. The sanctuary of the Pythian priestess was in Delphi, which was not too far away from Corinth. In fact, like I mentioned at the very, very beginning of the earlier session today, my wife and I were staying on the Gulf of Corinth, and we were looking literally into the mountains of Delphi. And so in terms of proximity, it's reasonably close to Corinth, and it's estimated that this sanctuary was active even around 1400 BC, and we know that it maintained active up until about 400 AD. There's dispute in terms of when it actually started, but experts, how do I say this? There's some reason to think that it had been active for about 1800 years. The one unique component of this particular sanctuary is and there's debate about this, and I guess I should contextualize all this. By anything I say, Pythian priestess at Delphi is one of the most contested topics in classical scholarship. Sources of the ancient world are problematic for two reasons. Number one is they vehemently disagree with each other in terms of descriptions of what happens at Delphi, the types of prophecies that were given, the legitimacy of the prophecies, but also they speak of the sanctuary at Delphi as if it's common knowledge. The problem with that is they don't give us a ton of information because they expect that you already know everything you need to know about Delphi. So even our reconstruction of the sanctuary is somewhat problematic. And I guess I should anchor the one reason why we're exploring the sanctuary of Delphi is not just because it would have been a common source of influence for Corinthian Christians. Excuse me. I totally lost my train of thought there. All right, we'll move on. Maybe the other reason will come back to me. Oh, here it is. Because, like we talked about before, if someone is like into 1 Corinthians 14, there's this component of women in prophecy and order, and the main prophetic agency and influence was a woman here, and that at the sanctuary, and that was pretty unusual, and that's one component of why it draws the attention of so many scholars, because that's one of the reasons it's different, that a woman ultimately was in charge. Now there's scholarly debate about, well, there were male priests, and did they actually have more influence? But that's neither here nor there for our purposes today. So imagine before you are a Christian in Corinth, and you may want to start a business, you may want to go on a trip, maybe the local city-state is raising an army and you're trying to decide, do I volunteer? You're trying to decide to take your life in a certain direction. So if you're wealthy enough, and if you have enough time, I'm going to take us through what it would be like, again in a reconstructed model, of a pre-Christian Corinthian going to the Pythian priestess and what that would actually look like as a framework for, again, you're a Corinthian, you're reading Paul's command to prophesy, you may have had personal experience with the Pythian system. That could have been a major reference point for the way that you're engaging with prophecy. So the Pythian priestess only prophesied on the 7th day of the month in honor of the birthday of Apollo, which mythologically was on the 7th month of the Greek calendar, or the 7th day of a month in the Greek calendar. However, she only prophesied 9 months out of the year. So you had to be fortunate enough to grab or to even have the chance for her to prophesy only 9 days out of the year. And many people, foreign kings, not even Greek, but Persian kings, to military generals, to wealthy, or even if you'd have to, I wouldn't say poor because you had to make enough money to engage in the system, but far and wide through the echelons of society, like I said, from 1400 through about 400 CE, people made it work on her schedule. Now, at dawn, the Pythian priestess would, here we go. The Pythian priestess would wake up at dawn, and she would take a purification bath in one of the streams there in Delphi. After she completed, she would walk up to a shrine of Apollo and offer a sacrifice. At this point in time, the male priests of Apollo would make a sacrifice as well, but for a different reason. They would take an unblemished, perfect lamb And, well, I guess not really a sacrifice, would perform a ritual is probably a better way to say it. They would take cold water, and this may sound ridiculous, they would take cold water and dump it on the ram. If the ram shuddered, that meant that Apollo was happy to be consulted for prophecy. If it did not shudder, then the sanctuary would be closed for that day. Now, imagine maybe you paid a ton of money to hire a sailor to bring you to Delphi, and you had to put pause on different business opportunities, and this was maybe the one chance you had to try and get a prophecy from the priestess, and then the ram doesn't shudder. And they're like, sorry, wait till next month. Within that system, that would be probably frustrating, right? Now, there's scholarly debate about what maybe they would dump another cup of water because there's an economy there, and there's kind of ways that they could maybe force an outcome, but again, that would be something that we could talk about at a different date. So, assuming that the ram shuddered, then people who arrived at Delphi would be put into groups in order to receive prophecy, but they had to distinguish between who got first priority. So if you were a Delphian, a local, you got first access. If you were a Greek, you got second access. And if you were a non-Greek, then you had third access. Now, there was a way to pay to cut the line, which is, to me, kind of funny and a little silly, but there were ways around that system. And there also was somewhat similar to the Jewish sacrificial system in Jesus' day. And Jesus actually took issue with this, that when you approach the Jewish temple, you had to buy a sacrifice, and you could see how that could be corrupted, and Jesus took issue with that. And here, you also, if you wanted a word from the oracle, you also had to buy at least 2 separate offerings in order to be eligible. And so at this point, the sources diverge even more. We have to kind of be very careful with the way we reconstruct this. But what's fascinating is if you were able to get through the line, you could afford the travel, you could afford to buy the different required sacrifices, then you could actually get an audience with the Pythian priestess. And at this point, there's a couple different ways that the Pythian priestess could deliver a word to you. And here I've listed a couple different options. At this point, the sources vehemently disagree, usually to argue a point that serves their greater purpose, whether the Pythian priestess was a fraud, whether men really controlled the sanctuary and she was just a puppet. There's a couple different interpretations for this. But what's fascinating to me is some descriptions is that the Pythian priestess ascends or descends, kind of depends on how you want to view it, into a prophetic type of madness and starts spouting, in English it's a bit derogatory, but starts speaking madness, starts speaking nonsense, words that don't have a meaning in any known language. Now, there's a potential overlap. It's hard to say at what level, but some of us may see a connection with speaking in tongues. Now, in Luke Acts, speaking in tongues primarily had to do with speaking in another language that people already knew, right? However, in this case, in descriptions of the Pythian priestess, she spoke words that had no meaning, and priests of Apollo had to interpret for her. Now, there's some interesting potentiality with mapping onto familiar systems of prophecy, but that is one of the descriptions of how she offered her words. Another was spontaneously, she could sing perfectly metered hexameter prophetic songs to people. Hexameter is an ancient time signature. It's related a bit to the time signature in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so there's also this poetic, this artistic, this musical component to the way that her prophetic transmission was recorded. There's also descriptions of her speaking like an elevated philosopher, in which her prose is distinguished with elevated language, and it's, if you've ever heard someone talk and they're kind of speaking at the sort of the apex of your knowledge, you can understand what they're saying, but you kind of have to reach for it. There's references of her speaking like that. In other words, she's highly intelligent, highly trained, probably exceptionally well-educated. Yet, and so it can be difficult for us to make sense of, well, which one did she mainly use? Which one is accurate? How much of this is polemical, in terms of, you can't trust the Pythian priestess because she's just speaking madness. It's ultimately hard to say. But like I indicated, we have references of Paul of singing heavenly songs to people. We have a potential bridge in terms of speaking in tongues. And so all that to say is an ancient Corinthian who may at various levels be familiar with the Pythian system, the sanctuary, the history. Maybe they're familiar with the literature that describes how she gave her words. That could be a reference point for someone. And Paul had to figure out how to navigate with that background coming from the Jewish the Jewish prophetic system. Now, it's 11:40. I'll end on this. You may be wondering what type, or you may be wanting an example of the types of prophecies that she gave. So I'll tell a little story. Who here is familiar with the battle at Thermopylae? It's been popularly rendered into film as 300, with Leonidas led the 300 Spartans. Most of us are probably familiar with that story at some level. So the situation, and I should take one step back and saying I'm not claiming the historicity of this. This is simply literature has been written in ancient sources describing this. So we can have a debate in terms of how much this maps onto ancient reality. Again, we're building that 2,000-year-old Jenga puzzle. Persia is attacking Greece. They've tried once before but failed. And Xerxes the First, and if you're familiar with your Old Testament history, that name may be familiar, he has conscripted an excessively large, highly trained infantry force, built a navy, and he wants to defend and reclaim the honor that his family had lost because his father, I think it was Darius, I forget offhand, attempted to attack Greece, but he failed. So he's doing everything he can to extend the Persian Empire into the Peloponnese. So the Athenians, they consult the Delphi Oracle. And this is what, I don't want to say this is what she said in a historical sense. This is what is written about what she said. There we go. Now your statues are standing and pouring sweat. They shiver with dread. The black blood drips from the highest rooftops. They have seen the necessity of evil. Get out of my sanctum, and drown your spirits in woe. Now, that doesn't sound like the best prophetic word to get on the cusp of war with the Persian Empire. So the Athenians went back to Delphi and like, hey, can you help us out? Like, what do we do with that? Can you give us another word? So she responds a second time, and she said, a wall of wood alone shall be uncaptured, a boon to you and your children. Now, at this point, you can tell that one potential issue in Greeks, certain Greeks also had this perspective. The Pythian priestess, kind of like Polydius, like we talked about in the Iliad, sometimes their prophecies were overly vague. And depending on what you did with that prophecy, that could affect what it actually ended up meaning. And you'll see how that is manifested here in just a second. So the third time, or the Athenians received that word, and okay, that's, I guess, a little better, but a wall of wood, and it's like the only good thing coming out of this, like, you got to give me something else. So the Pythian responded a third time and said, await not in quiet the coming of the horses, the marching feet, the armed host upon the land. Slip away, turn your back. You will meet in battle anyway. O holy Salamis, which is an island, if I remember properly, east of the Peloponnese. You will be the death of many a woman's sons between the seed time and the harvest of the grain. So as Athens was receiving these three oracles and trying to make sense of them, and we have evidence of Themistocles, who was a statesman in Greece at the time. He took these prophecies it wasn't the Senate, it was a direct democracy, but in the ecclesia of the gathering of the people, trying to figure out how to ward off the attack from Persia, and he used these words in a political debate to trying to figure out what they're going to do. So it wasn't like these were sidelined in importance. These were used to decide the actual military response against Persia. So really, really important. During the same time, Sparta also consorted the oracle, trying to determine what to do, and she replied, the strength of bulls or lions cannot stop the foe. No, he will not leave off, I say, until he tears the city or the king limb from limb. Also, the local Delphians asked the oracle, what do we do? Because they are also under threat from the advance of Persia. And the oracle replied, pray to the winds, they will prove to be mighty allies of Greece. Now, if we're familiar with the story of the battle for Thermopylae, you may have already made certain connections between her words and history as we know what happened. King Leonidas took 300 Spartans and a contingent of Greek allies, and as we know, bravely fought to the death every last man at Thermopylae. And the words that she gave to the Spartans was that the strength of the bulls or lions cannot stop the foe. No, he will not leave off, I say, until he tears the city or the king limb from limb. So there's a question about, well, King Leonidas heard this word, he ended up dying in battle. And so there is overlap, but that draws from our discussion with Polydius about this interaction with something that was somewhat vague, but then someone did something with it. Moreover, the words given to Athens, the first one was, blood is flowing from the statues and great darkness is covering the city. I'm kind of interpreting here. In the last oracle, which included O Holy Salamis, so within the ecclesia of the Greeks, they interpreted that to mean Athens is going to fall to Xerxes. However, because the prophetess told us that Salamis is holy and not cursed, we're going to evacuate our people to Salamis and, in essence, pray that that's the right interpretation. Moreover, the Delphinians, they received the word to pray to the winds. So what ends up happening is, and I forget the historicity specifically, but the Battle of Salamis happens after the Battle of Thermopylae, and in it, a major storm erupts on the sea, and it proves to be a decisive victory for the Greeks. And later interpreters of these words say, hey, that wall of wood actually refers to the Navy fleet. And praying to the winds refers to the storm. And the king being torn limb from limb must have been Leonidas. And the Pythian was right in that blood dripped from the statues of Athens, because some Athenians did not in fact flee from Athens to Salamis. They stayed trying to defend their homeland, but they were killed. Athens was in fact burned to the ground. But most of the Athenian people were actually safe in Salamis, O holy Salamis. And so this is an example of why the Pythian priestess was so important to Greek religion, why it maintained an active influence for over 1,800 years, why ancient writers wrote of her fame as if it was common knowledge, but also why there's so much disagreement, why ancient writers use different interpretive tactics to try to make sense of how do I say this? You could view it as accuracy. You could also view it as it's sufficiently vague so that no matter what you do, you can kind of see how it came true. Like and this is ancient opinions. This isn't just modern, not superimposing scholarly attempts to understand, even though they do. And so this also served as a problem within ancient Greek culture as well. And so with respect to the Corinthians in Paul's day, whether or not they were familiar with the Battle of the Thermopylae and whether they are not familiar with those specific words, this was as influential, meaning the fame, the notoriety, potentially even understanding the mechanics of the sanctuary at Delphi, as knowing the Iliad, Odyssey. This was a main pillar of reference for what is prophecy like. And again, that helps us color our understanding of when Paul said, I'm eager for you to prophesy, he had to deal with their reference point of the Pythian fame and her way of doing things. And we are about closing. So, with that said, we have a question. Okay, I guess we'll jump into questions. My wife.
Okay, this is more of a clarification for us non-scholars in the room. So basically, you're painting a picture of what it was like, what prophecy was like, their perspective of what prophecy was like, and that it was very significant that Paul is now saying, I desire that you all prophesy. It's not, you don't have to travel now and pay all this money to get a prophetic word potentially once a month, but now it's open and available to everyone.
Well, that's an interesting observation. There is a widening and a more communal emphasis to prophecy. I hadn't thought of that. At the same, that's a kind of interesting thought. If I was going to respond to it, I'd be processing in the moment. But it is mostly accurate that prophets were trained, that they specialized in a particular form of prophecy. Now, you could have charlatan prophets, and there's critique of that in Greek culture and literature. But it is a valid point to specify that instead of going and engaging in these solidified systems or schools or sanctuaries, it is true that Paul opens up that opportunity for people who, how do I say this? He does kind of flip that model on its head, that you don't have to go to school, you don't have to get a PhD in intrail prophecy, that day one Christian, you can engage in authentic prophecy out of the gate. And I guess there's interesting components for how that could affect discipleship and sort of a pastoral reading of 1 Corinthians. In terms of everyday normal people prophesying, I actually don't know much about that. That'd be a very interesting study. So I don't have much to say about that, but that is a really good point. Thank you. Anybody else? Another one from Chuck. Chuck is asking where I got the pictures for the background. It took me very many hours. Originally, I was just going to go through notes, but then I realized that we have this. I was like, what am I doing? I'm going to find pictures. So most of, all the pictures are in, most of the pictures are public domain, and most of them are Renaissance paintings of the topics that I've been discussing, not all of them. Two of the pictures I took myself. So come on. Here are the Bacchae. My wife and I, when we were in Athens, This is the temple of Dionysus, which is also it's the theater of Dionysus, which also doubled as a temple in an ancient Greek religion, plays, performances, music that was conceptualized religiously. So I actually took that, so we're right there. In fact, it doesn't give you the proper scale. If you looked like this outward with the seats moving up, you could fit a lot of people there. And then I also took the very first image here. Otherwise, like the picture of the eagle, I used Unsplash, and so because that's kind of open source pictures. But most of them are historical visual representations of the themes that we're talking about. One last point before I ask for any other questions. Next week, I hope to continue in this trajectory. And one of the topics, and this is similar to the Pythian priestess, and it connects to other points I made earlier, is in the ancient Mediterranean world, often maybe too strong of a word, but women engaging in enthusiastic, ecstatic, religious behavior was, I don't want to say common, but it was a part of your religious options. And so here we're looking at a visual representation of the Maenads, which were a group of women who principally worshipped Dionysus, and as a part of that, the process of engaging in a ritual, they often were described as losing their minds, engaging in mad fits of dancing, and it being a very chaotic place. And so, again, there's sort of a developing that world around 1 Corinthians, and this potentially being a background for a woman, new Christ follower. Their background is maybe it was the week before, she was a worshiper of Dionysus, and she's used to worshiping in a particular way. So this is kind of an advertisement for what I hope to get into next week. So with that said, are there any ending questions? Okay, cool. If you do have questions, but you don't want to ask them publicly, that is fine. You're free to ping me if you're part of the base camp ecosystem. Otherwise, I don't know if I want to speak my email out because it's going out on the internet. Find a way to talk with me. I guess I'll leave it vague at that. And I will see you next week. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining us online. We'd love to know where you're watching from or how we can pray for you. So please let us know in the comments, and be sure to share this content with your friends. Also, if you want prayer or prophetic encouragement, we offer free ministry available on a first come, first served basis on our website. Be sure to check the description of this video for more information. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again soon. Here's a word from some of our other ministries.
Hey everybody, this is Pastor David Kingsley reminding you in 2 weeks we're going to have the Pulse. Every third Friday at 6:30. The doors are open to everybody. And don't forget Isaiah 22:22. Some doors need to be open, some doors need to be closed. Let's come out to the Pulse and let's close some doors and let's open some doors.
Hi. Most of us go through times of testing and trials, and often during these times we see negative patterns developing in our life. Often these are caused by generational curses. At the upcoming seminar, which I'll be teaching, you will get revelation, and also you'll get prayer to break these curses and release the fullness of God's blessings in your life so you can walk in your calling and freedom. If you want more information, look at the description at the bottom of your screen.
Jesus promised that we would do supernatural works. Now is the time for you to step into God's power. We invite you to our Healing Intensive, in which you'll be equipped to step into a supernatural lifestyle of healings and miracles. You'll enjoy 2 jam-packed days full of practical teaching and powerful activation. Hundreds of people have been empowered through our trainings, and we can't wait to see what God will do through you too. Join us in person or online. For more information, please click the link in the description and we'll see you there.
As disciples of Jesus, it's vital that we study God's Word and start activating it in our daily lives. I'd like to invite you to Equip Nights, where our goal is to equip you for a life of impact and purpose. We're going to be diving into key subjects like your new identity, your authority in Christ, and the power of prayer, and many more. With the help of qualified teachers and an amazing course book, you're going to see some real results. These courses will be 5 sessions long, taking place once a week during the evenings, making them accessible for those who are working. For more information, please check out the description link below.
Jesus said that the sheep know the voice of the shepherd and they follow him. Yet many Christians lack confidence that they hear the voice of God for themselves. This prophetic boot camp is designed to equip you in the many ways that God speaks. You will learn to hear the voice of God yourself. You will receive prophetic ministry from many different types of people and have an opportunity to interact with the speakers and ask those questions you've always wanted to know. Join people from all over the world at the Healing Rooms of the Santa Maria Valley, November 5th and 6th, 2021. Click on the link below in the description to sign up.